Imagine a palace suddenly falling silent. Imagine a 10-year-old girl, robbed of her mother, forced to learn the hard language of duty long before she understood the language of grief. For most, such a blow would be the end of a childhood. For this girl, it was the beginning of a queen. She was Princess Ingrid of Sweden, the granddaughter of Queen Victoria, born into a world that promised a fairy tale. But in an instant, she learned a brutal lesson that no amount of royal blood can shield you from the deepest of human sorrows. This is the story of how that broken-hearted child became an unbreakable matriarch, a queen who would face down the armies of Hitler and become the steady beating heart of a nation. To truly grasp the woman Ingrid would become, we must first travel back to the dawn of the 20th century, to a Europe that was, in its final glittering moments, still a family affair. The continent was a complex web of empires and kingdoms, and at the center of that web, like a formidable matriarch, sat the memory of Queen Victoria. By the time of her death in 1901, she wasn't just a monarch, she was the grandmother of Europe. Her children and grandchildren occupied the thrones of Germany, Russia, Greece, Spain, Romania, and Norway. A royal wedding was not a private celebration. It was a major geopolitical event, a stitch in the vast quilt of dynastic alliances designed to keep the continent in a delicate, if precarious, balance. Into this world of interwoven bloodlines and high-stakes diplomacy, on March 28, 1910, a new royal life began. At the Royal Palace in Stockholm, a grand imposing edifice that dominates the city's waterfront, Princess Ingrid Victoria Sophia Louise Margarethe was born. She was the third child and only daughter of Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf of Sweden and his wife Crown Princess Margaret. Her birth was significant. Through her father, she was a princess of Sweden's Bernadotte dynasty, a relatively new royal house founded by one of Napoleon's marshals, which had skillfully navigated Sweden into a position of stable armed neutrality. But it was through her mother that she inherited her most potent legacy. Her mother, Margaret of Connaught, was the daughter of Prince Arthur, Duke of Connaught, who was the third son of Queen Victoria. This meant that the baby princess in Stockholm was a great-granddaughter of the late British Queen Empress. This dual heritage would be the defining feature of her early life. She was Swedish by birth and destiny, but her upbringing, her culture, and the very atmosphere of her home would be profoundly, unmistakably English. The Sweden into which Ingrid was born was a country of contrast. On one hand, it was a nation rapidly modernizing, a beacon of progressive social policy and industrial innovation. On the other, its court still clung to a rigid, almost austere formality. The royal palace in Stockholm was a world of strict etiquette, of hushed corridors and official functions, a place where children were often expected to be seen and not heard. It was a life governed by the clockwork precision of duty, but Ingrid's parents, particularly her mother, were determined to create a different kind of world for their children. Crown Princess Margaret, known affectionately to her family as Daisy, was a revelation in the stiff Swedish court. She was a true product of the less formal English royal tradition established by her grandmother Victoria's own family life at Balmoral and Osborne House. Daisy was vibrant, artistic, and possessed a warm, down-to-earth charm that captivated the Swedish people. She was a talented painter and a passionate, knowledgeable gardener. But most importantly, she was a devoted and hands-on mother, a concept that was still somewhat revolutionary in the highest circles of European royalty. Her husband, the scholarly and more reserved Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf, adored her. He was a man of quiet intellectual pursuits, a keen archaeologist, and art historian, who would one day be known as one of Europe's most learned monarchs. Where he was serious and methodical, Daisy was spontaneous and full of life. Theirs was a genuine love match, and together they formed a partnership that was both a romantic ideal and a modernizing force within the Swedish monarchy. They were determined that their 5 children, Gustaf, Adolf, Sigvard, Ingrid, Bertil, and Carl Johan, would experience something more than a life of cold protocol. They wanted to give them a real childhood. The stage for this idyllic childhood was Sofiero Palace, their summer residence on the coast of southern Sweden. If the Stockholm Palace was a symbol of duty, Sofiero was a paradise of freedom. Here, under Daisy's direction, the formal manicured grounds were transformed into a sprawling, romantic English-style garden. It was a place of riotous color, of winding paths and magnificent rhododendron displays that she planned and planted with her own hands. Sofiero was more than a palace. It was a home. It was here that Princess Ingrid spent the happiest days of her young life. She and her 4 brothers were given a freedom that was almost unheard of for royal children of that era. They were encouraged to play outdoors, to get their hands dirty, to engage in sports, and to learn about the natural world. Their mother, the crown princess, was not a distant ceremonial figure. She was at the center of their world, joining in their games, teaching them to garden, and personally overseeing their education. The primary language spoken in the nursery, and indeed in the family's private moments, was English. English nannies were employed, and English customs were observed. For young Ingrid, this meant that from her earliest moments, she was straddling 2 worlds. She was a princess of Sweden, but her heart and home life were steeped in the traditions of her British heritage. Ingrid's early personality was a fascinating blend of her parents' traits. She had her father's seriousness and sense of order, but she also possessed her mother's strong will and a quiet, determined nature. As the only girl amongst 4 boisterous boys, she learned early on how to hold her own. She was not a classic girly princess. She was athletic, loved riding and skiing, and was known for her disciplined and organized approach to everything she did. Photographs from this time show a serious-faced little girl with large, watchful eyes, often standing slightly apart from her brothers, observing the world with a thoughtful intensity that seemed beyond her years. She was being groomed for a life of duty, but a duty that her mother hoped would be tempered with personal happiness and fulfillment. This sunlit period of her life, however, was lived against a backdrop of gathering darkness. In 1914, when Ingrid was just 4 years old, the First World War erupted, tearing the great family of European royalty apart. Her mother's cousins were now on opposing sides of the most brutal conflict in human history, King George V in Britain and Kaiser Wilhelm II in Germany. While Sweden remained neutral, the war's shadow was long. There were food shortages, political tensions, and the constant, horrifying news from the front lines. For a child, the full implications would have been impossible to grasp, but the atmosphere of anxiety, the absence of normality, would have been a pervasive part of her early consciousness. The golden Edwardian afternoon into which she had been born was over. The world was changing, violently and irrevocably. But for the Swedish royal children, protected within the bubble of Sofiero, the most devastating blow was yet to come. It would not be delivered by a foreign army or a political revolution. It would come from within their own home, a cruel, silent thief that would steal the light from their world and change the course of Ingrid's life forever. In the autumn of 1920, the family was gathered at the royal palace in Stockholm. Crown Princess Margaret, now 38, was pregnant with her 6th child and eagerly awaiting the birth. She was, by all accounts, in perfect health and spirits. The future seemed bright. The war was over, the family was thriving, and another baby was on the way. But then a minor illness took a sudden catastrophic turn. Margaret had been suffering from a mastoid infection in her ear, a painful but usually treatable condition. An operation was performed, but in the pre-antibiotic era, even minor surgery carried immense risks. A virulent infection, identified as erysipelas, set in and quickly spread, developing into sepsis. Her condition deteriorated with terrifying speed. On the 1st of May, 1920, just a few days after falling ill, Crown Princess Margaret of Sweden, the beloved Daisy, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, died. She was 8 months pregnant. For 10-year-old Ingrid, the news was an incomprehensible cataclysm. One moment her mother was there, the vibrant, loving center of her universe, the source of all warmth and security. The next, she was gone. There was no long illness, no time to prepare, no chance to say goodbye, just a sudden, absolute, and terrifying silence. The impact of this loss on the family was devastating. Crown Prince Gustaf Adolf was shattered by the death of his adored wife. His grief was profound and would stay with him for the rest of his life. For the 5 children, it was the end of their world as they knew it. The warmth and spontaneity that their mother had brought to their lives vanished overnight. The royal palace, which had been softened by her presence, once again became a place of stiff formality and quiet, echoing grief. For Ingrid, the only daughter, the blow was particularly acute. She not only lost her mother, but also her primary role model, her confidant, and her guide to the complex world of being a royal woman. In an instant, she went from being a carefree child to the senior female figure in her immediate family. A heavy, unspoken burden settled on her young shoulders. It was in this crucible of loss that the core of her character was forged. The stoicism, the self-reliance, the almost formidable sense of duty for which she would become famous, all of these traits had their roots in this one unbearable moment. She learned to suppress her own grief, to present a composed and dignified face to the world, even as her own heart was breaking. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe a young girl who rarely cried in public, who carried herself with a maturity far beyond her years. This was not a sign of coldness, but of a profound and deeply ingrained survival mechanism. She had learned the hardest lesson of royal life, that personal sorrow must always be secondary to public duty. In the years that followed, her father did his best to hold the family together. He was a loving and devoted parent, but he could not replace the unique maternal warmth that had been lost. The household was run with efficiency, but the laughter and lightheartedness were gone. Then, in 1923, after 3 years as a widower, Gustaf Adolf remarried. His choice of a new wife was, in many ways, a very logical one. He chose Lady Louise Mountbatten. Louise was, like Ingrid's mother, a descendant of Queen Victoria. She was the sister of Lord Louis Dickey Mountbatten and a great-granddaughter of the late Queen. This marriage re-established the strong British connection that was so important to the family. But Louise was a very different woman from Margaret. Where Margaret had been confident and outgoing, Louise was known to be more nervous, shy, and had lived through the harrowing experience of the Russian Revolution, where several of her relatives had been murdered. The challenge of becoming a stepmother to 5 grieving children, one of whom was a fiercely independent teenage princess, was immense. Ingrid's relationship with her new stepmother was complex. On the surface, it was perfectly correct and respectful. Ingrid, with her ingrained sense of duty, performed her role as a stepdaughter impeccably. But the easy, affectionate bond she had shared with her own mother was impossible to replicate. Louise was a kind woman, but she could never fill the void that Daisy had left. This further reinforced Ingrid's self-reliance. She learned to depend on herself, to make her own judgments, and to keep her deepest feelings private. As she moved through her teenage years and into young adulthood, Ingrid blossomed into a striking and elegant young woman. She was not beautiful in a conventional, flashy way. Her appeal lay in her regal bearing, her intelligent eyes, and an air of quiet, self-possessed dignity. She was highly accomplished, fluent in several languages, including English, French, and German, and had a deep knowledge of art and history. She took her public duties seriously, becoming a patron of various charities and organizations, particularly those related to women and children. She was being perfectly prepared for the one great, unavoidable destiny of a European princess of her generation, a dynastic marriage. By the early 1930s, the marriage market for Princess Ingrid was a subject of intense speculation across the courts of Europe. As the only daughter of the Swedish crown prince and a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she was one of the most eligible princesses of her time. A number of suitors were considered, but the most talked about, and for a time, the most likely candidate, was the most eligible bachelor in the world, Edward, the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VIII of Great Britain. A match between Ingrid and David, as he was known to his family, would have been seen as perfect. It would have united the two branches of Queen Victoria's family, creating a powerful Anglo-Scandinavian alliance. They were distant cousins. They moved in the same social circles, and from a dynastic perspective, it made perfect sense. But from a personal perspective, it was a non-starter. The Prince of Wales was a world-famous celebrity, a dashing and charismatic figure, but he was also notoriously restless, emotionally immature, and already deeply involved in his pursuit of married women, a path that would eventually lead him to Wallis Simpson and the abdication crisis. Ingrid, on the other hand, was serious, grounded, and deeply valued stability and duty. She was reportedly unimpressed by his playboy lifestyle and flighty personality. While they met on several occasions, no romantic spark was ever ignited. Ingrid was looking for a partner, a man of substance with whom she could build a life and a family. She was not interested in being the consort to a man-child, no matter how charming or powerful he was. Her quiet rejection of the future King of England was an early and powerful indication of her strong character and her refusal to compromise her own values for the sake of a glittering title. The search continued, and then a new candidate emerged, a prince from the neighboring kingdom of Denmark. His name was Frederik, Crown Prince of Denmark, and he was, in almost every way, the polar opposite of the Prince of Wales, and in many ways, a marked contrast to Ingrid herself. Crown Prince Frederik was the eldest son of King Christian X of Denmark. He was a robust, outgoing, and thoroughly unpretentious man. He had chosen a career in the Navy, a life that had instilled in him a love for the sea and a camaraderie with ordinary sailors. He was famous for his informality, his booming laugh, and, most scandalously for the time, his collection of naval tattoos which covered his arms and torso. He was not an intellectual like Ingrid's father, nor a polished charmer like the Prince of Wales. He was a man of action, a man of the people, boisterous and full of life. On paper, the reserved, dignified, and highly cultured Swedish princess and the tattooed, fun-loving Danish sailor prince seemed an unlikely pair. But when they were formally introduced, something clicked. Perhaps it was a case of opposites attracting. Frederik was charmed by Ingrid's quiet elegance and intelligence, and she, in turn, may have been drawn to his warmth, his lack of pretense, and his infectious zest for life. Here was a man who was solid, reliable, and authentic. Here was a man with whom she could build the stable family life she so deeply craved, the life that had been torn from her as a child. Their courtship progressed, and in 1935 their engagement was announced. The news was greeted with delight in both Sweden and Denmark. It was a popular match, a union that seemed to promise a bright future for the Danish monarchy. For Ingrid, it marked the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another, far more challenging one. She was about to leave her home, her country, and everything she had ever known to become the future queen of a new nation. She was stepping out of the long shadow of her childhood grief and into the full glare of her royal destiny. Her new life and her greatest tests were about to begin in Denmark. And so, the chapter of Princess Ingrid's Swedish youth closed, not with a whisper, but with the joyous peal of wedding bells and the cheers of two nations. The little girl, who had lost her mother and learned to navigate a lonely palace, had grown into a poised and determined young woman, ready to embrace her destiny. But leaving the home that had both nurtured and wounded her was only the first step. Ahead of her lay the immense challenge of becoming Danish, of winning the heart of a new country, and of forging a partnership with a man who was her opposite in almost every way. She was stepping into what she hoped would be a life of peaceful duty. When a princess marries, she doesn't just gain a husband. She often loses a home. For Princess Ingrid of Sweden, her wedding day on May 24, 1935, was not merely the start of a new life, but the formal end of the old one. The life of a Swedish princess, the only daughter of a future king, was over. Before her lay a new unknown path, a new language to master, a new people to win over, and a new title to inhabit, Crown Princess of Denmark. She was stepping into a role that would demand everything from her, a role that would soon be tested not by the gentle protocols of peacetime, but by the brutal realities of war and occupation. The fairy tale was over. The true test of her character was about to begin. The wedding itself was the last great royal spectacle of a Europe still pretending it could hold back the tide of history. Royalty from across the continent descended on Stockholm. King George V and Queen Mary of Great Britain sent their son, the Duke of Kent. The future King and Queen of Norway were there. It was a final glittering gathering of the clans, a testament to the intricate web of kinship that still bound the continent's monarchies together. For Ingrid, it was a day of immense public joy and profound private farewells. As she stood on the deck of the Danish royal yacht, the Dannebrog, leaving Stockholm's harbor, she was watching not just a city but her entire past recede into the distance. Her arrival in Copenhagen was met with a rapturous welcome. The Danish people, charmed by the prospect of the elegant Swedish princess joining their more down-to-earth royal family, turned out in their thousands. But behind the cheering crowds and official ceremonies lay an immense personal challenge. Ingrid was no longer in her father's house. She was now the second lady in a foreign land, under the watchful eye of her formidable father-in-law, King Christian X, and a Danish public that was curious, hopeful, but also appraising. Her first and most crucial task was to become Danish. This was a challenge she attacked with the same methodical discipline and quiet determination that had defined her since childhood. She immediately began intensive Danish lessons, and to the surprise and delight of the court, she mastered the notoriously difficult language with remarkable speed, soon speaking it almost without a Swedish accent. This was more than a linguistic exercise. It was a profound act of respect. It sent a clear message to her new country. I am not here as a visitor. I am one of you. She also threw herself into learning Danish history, culture, and social customs. She traveled the length and breadth of the country, from the bustling streets of Copenhagen to the remote fishing villages of Jutland, meeting people from all walks of life. She had a sharp, inquisitive mind, and she was a keen observer. She quickly grasped the unique character of the Danish people, their blend of informal friendliness, fierce patriotism, and the untranslatable concept of hygge, that cozy, contented sense of well-being. She recognized that to win their hearts, she couldn't remain a distant, formal Swedish princess. She had to understand them, to connect with them, and to earn their trust. Her new home was Amalienborg Palace, a complex of 4 identical Rococo palaces around an octagonal courtyard in the heart of Copenhagen. It was here that she and Frederik set up their own household, and it was here that the fascinating dynamic of their marriage began to unfold. They were, in many ways, a study in contrasts. Frederik, the sailor prince, was loud, boisterous, and happiest when surrounded by friends, music, and laughter. He was a talented amateur conductor and pianist, and their home was often filled with the sound of his informal concerts. Ingrid was his opposite, reserved, organized, and introspective. She provided the calm, steadying influence that he desperately needed. Frederik had grown up in the shadow of his austere and authoritarian father, King Christian X, and was known to be somewhat intimidated by the formalities of his position. He was notoriously shy when it came to public speaking. It was Ingrid who took him in hand. She patiently coached him, helping him to write his speeches and practice his delivery. She gave him the confidence he lacked, gently but firmly preparing him for the throne that would one day be his. She was not just his wife, she was his partner, his most trusted advisor, and the architect of his future success as a monarch. He adored her for it. Theirs was a relationship built on a deep complementary bond. He brought warmth and joy into her serious, duty-bound life, and she in turn gave his life structure, purpose, and a regal dignity he might not have achieved on his own. This new life also brought Ingrid the one thing she had craved most deeply since the death of her own mother, the chance to build a family of her own. She was determined to be a different kind of mother from the distant, protocol-bound figures she had known. She wanted to be present, to be hands-on, to create the same kind of warm, loving environment that her own mother, Daisy, had so briefly provided at Sofiero. Her first child, a daughter, was born on April 16, 1940. She was named Margrethe. The birth of a princess would normally have been a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy, but the timing of her arrival transformed it into something far more momentous, far more poignant, because just 1 week before Princess Margrethe was born, the world of idyllic Danish neutrality had been brutally, violently torn apart. Throughout the late 1930s, the shadow of Nazi Germany had loomed ever larger over Europe. Denmark, like Ingrid's native Sweden, desperately clung to a policy of neutrality, even signing a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1939. But it was a futile gesture. In the early hours of April 9, 1940, the German war machine rolled across the border. The Danish government, facing overwhelming military force and the threat of Copenhagen being bombed into rubble, capitulated after only a few hours of token resistance. The occupation of Denmark had begun. For Ingrid, who was 9 months pregnant, and for the entire royal family, it was a moment of profound shock and terror. Suddenly, their home was no longer their own. German soldiers patrolled the streets outside Amalienborg Palace. The swastika flag flew over official buildings. They were, in effect, prisoners in their own capital. In this moment of national crisis, the royal family faced a critical choice. Several other European monarchies, when faced with invasion, had chosen to flee and form governments in exile. But King Christian X, with the full support of his family, made a different, far more dangerous decision. They would stay. They would not abandon their people. They would endure the occupation alongside them. This decision was one of the most important in the history of the modern Danish monarchy. It transformed the royal family from mere figureheads into powerful, living symbols of the nation's unbroken spirit. And at the heart of this quiet, dignified resistance was Crown Princess Ingrid. The birth of her daughter, Margrethe, just 7 days into the occupation, was seen by the Danish people as a miraculous sign of hope. In a time of darkness and fear, the arrival of a new life in the royal palace was a powerful affirmation of continuity, a defiant gesture against the forces of destruction. The little princess was immediately dubbed a ray of sunshine in a dark time. Ingrid understood the power of symbolism better than anyone. She knew that every public gesture, every choice she made, would be scrutinized by both the Danish people and their German occupiers. She could not lead an army, but she could lead a campaign of morale, and she did so with a courage and subtlety that was breathtaking. One of her most famous acts of defiance was astonishingly simple. Almost every day, she would either walk or ride her bicycle through the streets of Copenhagen, pushing her baby daughter in her pram or carrying her in a bicycle seat. This seemingly mundane act was, in reality, a masterstroke of psychological warfare. It sent a clear message. We are not afraid. We are not hiding. We are still here, living our lives, and you will not break us. The sight of the beautiful young crown princess and her infant daughter on the streets became a daily dose of courage for the citizens of Copenhagen. It was a silent, graceful up yours to the German soldiers who had to stand by and watch. She also used her children's clothing as a form of protest, often dressing them in the red and white of the Danish flag or in fabrics with patriotic motifs. She encouraged the revival of old Danish folk traditions and songs, turning her household into a quiet incubator of national culture at a time when that culture was under threat. Behind the scenes, her resolve was even harder. There is a well-documented, though intensely private story of a confrontation she had with her own grandfather, King Gustaf, the Fifth of Sweden. The Swedish king, desperate to maintain his country's precarious neutrality, was under immense pressure from Germany. He reportedly wrote to Ingrid, urging her and the Danish royal family to be more compliant, more reasonable with the occupying forces. Ingrid's response was said to have been swift and unyielding. She refused. Her loyalty was no longer to Sweden, it was to Denmark, her husband's country, her children's country, the country whose fate she now shared. It was a moment of immense personal courage, standing up not only to the Nazis, but to her own powerful grandfather. She had chosen her side, and she would not waver. Life under the 5-year occupation was a long, grinding ordeal. As the war progressed, the German grip tightened. The Danish resistance movement grew more active, and the German reprisals became more brutal. In 1943, after a wave of strikes and sabotage, the Germans dissolved the Danish government and imposed direct military rule. The royal family was placed under effective house arrest at Amalienborg. During this period, the king had a serious riding accident, leaving him an invalid for the rest of his reign. The burden of representing the monarchy fell even more heavily on Crown Prince Frederik, and by extension on Ingrid. She bore the strain with her characteristic fortitude. She managed her household through periods of severe rationing, continuing her quiet acts of defiance. She gave birth to her second daughter, Benedicta, in 1944, another symbol of life continuing in the face of death. She was, for the Danish people, the embodiment of a wife and mother enduring the same hardships and fears as they were, but doing so on a public stage, with the added pressure of knowing that one wrong move could have catastrophic consequences. And then finally, it was over. On May 5, 1945, Denmark was liberated. The news was met with an explosion of joy across the country. The streets of Copenhagen filled with delirious cheering crowds. At Amalienborg Palace, the royal family appeared on the balcony, time and time again to greet their jubilant people. The images from that day are incredibly powerful. You can see the relief, the exhaustion, and the profound, unbreakable bond that had been forged between the monarchy and the people during 5 years of shared suffering. For Ingrid, this was a moment of profound personal and public triumph. She had arrived in Denmark 10 years earlier as a foreign princess. She had now emerged from the crucible of war as a Danish national heroine. She had earned her place not through birth or marriage, but through courage, loyalty, and a shared ordeal. The Swedish rose had put down deep, unshakable roots in Danish soil, and no one would ever again question where her heart belonged. The war had been her greatest test, and she had passed it with unwavering grace, but her duties were far from over. The throne, with all of its immense responsibilities, now awaited. Having emerged from the crucible of war, Crown Princess Ingrid was no longer a foreign royal. She was a Danish heroine. Her place in the nation's heart sealed by 5 years of shared hardship and quiet defiance. The sound of liberation that filled the streets of Copenhagen was a testament to the powerful bond forged in adversity. But the adrenaline of survival must eventually give way to the steady, patient work of rebuilding. The dramatic, symbolic gestures of resistance would now need to be replaced by the decades-long task of shaping a monarchy for a new world. With the death of the old king on the horizon, the throne itself awaited. Ingrid's greatest test of courage was over, but her greatest work as queen consort, as a modernizer of the court, and as the guiding hand of a new reign, was just about to begin. Liberation turned a wartime symbol into a national anchor. The dramatic gestures of resistance gave way to the steady work of rebuilding, and to Ingrid's next role as the country's future queen. The immediate post-war years were a period of profound national introspection and reconstruction. Denmark, though spared the physical devastation of many other European nations, bore the deep psychological scars of occupation. The task facing the monarchy was to serve as a unifying force, to help heal the divisions, and to embody the renewed spirit of Danish sovereignty. Frederik and Ingrid threw themselves into this work with tireless energy. They traveled extensively throughout the country, their presence a comforting and familiar sight in towns and villages that were slowly returning to life. They were no longer just royals, they were fellow survivors, and their connection with the people was more direct and emotional than ever before. Then, on April 20th, 1947, the old era officially came to a close. King Christian X, the stoic symbol of Danish resistance whose daily horseback rides through occupied Copenhagen had become legendary, passed away. The nation mourned the loss of its wartime king, but all eyes now turned to his successor. From the balcony of Christiansborg Palace, the Prime Minister proclaimed the new monarch to the thousands gathered below. King Christian is dead. Long live His Majesty, King Frederik IX. Standing beside the new king was his wife, now Her Majesty Queen Ingrid of Denmark. At 37 years old, she had reached the pinnacle of her royal destiny. But for Ingrid, being queen was not about the pomp and the jewels. It was about the work. She had spent 12 years in Denmark meticulously preparing for this moment, and she had a clear and sophisticated vision of what a modern queen consort should be. She understood that in a post-war, increasingly democratic world, the monarchy's survival depended not on divine right, but on its utility, its dignity, and its ability to connect with the people. The reign of King Frederik IX and Queen Ingrid marked a significant stylistic shift for the Danish monarchy. Frederik, with his easygoing charm and naval background, was a true people's king. He dispensed with much of the rigid formality of his father's court, preferring a more direct and accessible approach. He spoke the language of the common man because, in many ways, he was one. But it was Ingrid who provided the essential counterbalance. She was the architect of the reign's elegance, its discipline, and its impeccable sense of style. If Frederik was the heart of the new monarchy, Ingrid was its backbone and its supremely intelligent brain. One of her first and most significant tasks was the complete overhaul of the royal household and its residences. The palaces had over the years become somewhat stuffy and dated. Ingrid, with her deep knowledge of art and history and her unerring eye for design, set about transforming them. This was not a mere redecoration. It was a carefully considered project of cultural curation. She studied the history of each building, working with historians and craftsmen to restore rooms to their original splendor while also making them comfortable, functional homes for a modern family. She had an almost academic interest in Danish silver, porcelain, and furniture, and she used her position to champion the nation's artisans. Amalienborg Palace and their country retreat, Fredensborg Palace, were infused with her signature style, a blend of grand historical elegance and clean, bright Scandinavian modernity. She created a court that was dignified but not remote, regal but not ostentatious. It was a reflection of her own personality. She applied this same methodical efficiency to her public duties. Ingrid was not a queen who simply showed up and smiled. She was famously, almost intimidatingly, well prepared. Before any engagement, whether it was opening a hospital wing or attending a cultural gala, she would meticulously research the organization and the people involved. She was known for asking sharp, insightful questions that demonstrated a genuine and deep understanding of the subject at hand. This professionalism earned her immense respect. People knew that Queen Ingrid's patronage was not a frivolous gesture. It was a serious endorsement from a woman who did her homework. She championed causes that were close to her heart, social welfare, particularly for single mothers and children, the Girl Guides, an organization she had been involved with since her youth, and the arts and cultural heritage of Denmark. But for all the public demands of her role, it was in her private life that her true passions and character were most fully expressed. Her sanctuary, the place where she could shed the weight of the crown, was Gråsten Palace. This summer residence in southern Jutland became her personal project, her canvas. Here, she could indulge the love of gardening she had inherited from her mother Daisy. The parallels to her own childhood at Sofiero were undeniable. Just as her mother had brought a piece of England to the shores of Sweden, Ingrid created a magnificent English-style garden in the heart of Denmark. Her work at Gråsten was a labor of love that would span decades. She designed and oversaw the creation of a stunning kitchen garden, a perennial garden, and vast, colorful borders. She was not a distant supervisor. She was a hands-on gardener, often found in old clothes with dirt under her fingernails, working alongside her staff. The garden was her creative outlet, a place of peace and order where she could connect with the rhythms of nature, far from the rigid schedule of the court. It was also the backdrop for her family life. At Gråsten, she and Frederik could create a sense of normalcy for their 3 daughters. It was a place for picnics, for swimming, for a freedom that was impossible to find in Copenhagen. As a mother, Ingrid was a blend of loving affection and firm discipline. Haunted by the memory of her own motherless childhood, she was determined to be a constant guiding presence in her daughters' lives. But she was also raising a future queen, and she never let them forget the responsibilities that awaited them. She instilled in them her own powerful sense of duty, her respect for tradition, and her practical, no-nonsense approach to life. There would be no spoiled princesses in her household. They were taught to be punctual, polite, and to always be mindful of their unique position. This focus on her daughters brought a looming constitutional crisis to the forefront. The Danish Act of Succession, dating from the 19th century, adhered to Salic law, meaning only males could inherit the throne. With 3 daughters and no sons, the crown was legally destined to pass not to Ingrid's eldest child, Margrethe, but to King Frederik's younger brother, Prince Connaught. By the early 1950s, this was no longer just a private family matter. It was a subject of intense national debate. The Danish people adored their king, their queen, and their 3 lovely princesses. The idea that the popular Margrethe would be passed over in favor of her less popular uncle was, to many, unthinkable. It seemed to go against the democratic and increasingly egalitarian spirit of the times. The situation placed Ingrid in a delicate position. She could not and would not publicly campaign for her own daughter, but her success as a mother was in itself the most powerful argument for change. She had raised a bright, capable, and charming young woman who was clearly fit to rule. The political will began to shift. In 1953, a new constitution was put before the Danish people in a national referendum. One of its key provisions was a new Act of Succession, which would allow for female primogeniture, meaning the eldest child, regardless of gender, could inherit the throne. The referendum passed with overwhelming support. Overnight, 13-year-old Princess Margrethe became the heir apparent. It was a monumental moment for Denmark, a step that aligned its ancient monarchy with modern values. For Ingrid, it must have been a moment of profound personal satisfaction. Her daughter's destiny was secure, and the future of the dynasty she had married into was safe. With the succession settled, the 1950s and 1960s became the golden age of their reign. Denmark was enjoying a period of post-war prosperity and social stability. The monarchy under Frederik and Ingrid was more popular than ever. They were the glamorous yet relatable face of a modern Scandinavian nation. They undertook numerous successful state visits, projecting an image of democratic stability and cultural sophistication. Ingrid, with her regal poise and flawless style, was a sensation on the world stage. This period also saw her successfully launch her own daughters into the world, navigating the complex diplomacy of their marriages. Each match was a dynastic success. Princess Benedict married a German prince, Richard of Sayn-Wittgenstein-Berleburg. Princess Anne-Marie made the most spectacular match of all, marrying the young King Constantine II of Greece in 1964, making Ingrid the mother of a reigning queen. And in 1967, her heir, Crown Princess Margrethe, married a French diplomat, Count Henri de Laborde de Montpezat. Ingrid had now become a matriarch in her own right, her family's connections once again stretching across the map of Europe, a subtle echo of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria. She had everything a woman in her position could want: a loving husband, 3 successful daughters, a host of beloved grandchildren, and the unwavering affection of her people. She was the respected and admired queen of a peaceful and prosperous nation. The storms of her youth and the horrors of war seemed a distant memory. The future seemed to promise a long and serene continuation of this happy state. But the one thing a queen can never control is time. And as the 1970s dawned, a final personal sorrow was gathering on the horizon, one that would once again test her immense reserves of strength and bring an end to the most important partnership of her life. King Frederik IX had always been a man of robust health and great physical energy, but in late 1971, he fell ill. What at first seemed like a bout of flu soon revealed itself to be something more serious. His health declined rapidly. The nation watched with growing anxiety as their beloved jovial king faded. He was moved to the municipal hospital in Copenhagen, and after a short acute illness, the end came. On January 14, 1972, with Ingrid and their daughters by his side, King Frederik IX died. He was 72 years old. The outpouring of grief across Denmark was immense. The people had lost the king who had been with them through war and peace, the man who felt more like a father to the nation than a distant sovereign. For Ingrid, the loss was incalculable. She had lost her husband of nearly 37 years, her partner, her confidant, and the anchor of her life. The pain of that loss was a profound echo of the grief she had felt as a 10-year-old girl. Once again, a central figure in her world had been taken from her. But even in her own deep sorrow, her sense of duty was absolute. Her first responsibility now was to her daughter. The day after the king's death, a new reign began. From the balcony of Christiansborg Palace, a grief-stricken but composed 31-year-old Margrethe was proclaimed Queen Margrethe II of Denmark. Standing just behind her, a figure of silent, unwavering support, was her mother. Ingrid was now the Queen Mother. Her time as Queen Consort was over. Her great defining partnership had come to an end. A new, lonelier, and in many ways, more challenging chapter of her life was about to begin. She would have to navigate the delicate role of being the mother of the monarch, a source of wisdom and support, without ever overstepping her bounds. The great love of her life was gone, but her service to Denmark was not yet finished. For 25 golden years she had reigned as Queen Consort, the indispensable partner to a beloved king and the architect of a stable modern court. Their partnership had come to define an era of Danish life, a period of peace, prosperity, and understated elegance. But the death of King Frederik IX in 1972 brought that era to a sudden, heartbreaking close. The partnership was over, and the role that had defined her entire adult life was gone. For any other woman, this might have marked a retreat into a quiet, grief-filled widowhood. But for Ingrid, it was the start of her final and perhaps most significant chapter. The question was no longer how to be a queen, but what it means to be a queen mother, how to step back from the throne while becoming more than ever the unshakable heart of the dynasty and the revered matriarch of a continent. There is a unique and terrible silence that follows the death of a king. For a nation, it is the closing of a chapter. For a queen, it is the end of a partnership that has defined her entire adult life. With Frederik's death in 1972, Ingrid became Dowager Queen, while her son-in-law Prince Henrik served as the Queen's consort. For many royal widows, this moment marks a retreat into quiet obscurity, a fade into the background of history. But Ingrid of Denmark was not like many others. The end of her reign as queen was not an ending. Instead, it was the beginning of her final and in many ways most powerful transformation. She was about to step into her last great role, not as a ruler, but as a guide, a touchstone of continuity, and the revered matriarch of both her nation and a new generation of European royalty. In the immediate aftermath of Frederik's death, Ingrid's primary focus was her daughter. At just 31 years old, Margrethe II was now the sovereign of Denmark, the first female ruler of the country in over 500 years. It was a daunting task for a young woman, and she was undertaking it while mourning the father she adored. In this critical moment of transition, Ingrid became her daughter's most essential source of support. But her support was a masterclass in constitutional propriety. She was never a power behind the throne. She understood with a profound instinct that her role now was to advise, not to command, to support, not to interfere. She made a series of symbolic but crucial decisions that established this new dynamic. She gracefully moved out of the primary royal apartments at Amalienborg, allowing the new queen and her husband, Prince Henrik, to establish their own court. She took up residence in a wing of Fredensborg Palace, the beautiful country estate she and Frederik had so loved. This physical step back was a clear public signal. The old reign was over, and she would do nothing to overshadow the new one. Privately, however, her influence remained immense. Queen Margrethe II would later speak often of how much she relied on her mother's counsel during the early years of her reign. Ingrid had nearly 4 decades of experience at the heart of the Danish state. She understood the intricate dance of politics, the personalities of world leaders, and the subtle nuances of court protocol in a way no one else did. She became a living encyclopedia of statecraft for her daughter. She would offer advice on everything from speechwriting to the proper handling of a state dinner. It was a quiet, behind-the-scenes mentorship, a mother teaching her daughter the craft of being a queen. She provided a steady hand on the rudder as Margrethe navigated the often treacherous waters of her new role, ensuring a seamless and stable transition of power. Her official public life did not end. It simply evolved. As the Queen Mother, or Dowager Queen as she was formerly known, she was freed from the day-to-day constitutional duties of a consort. This allowed her to focus even more intensely on the charitable and cultural work that had always been her passion. She did not retreat into retirement. On the contrary, she remained one of the most active and visible members of the royal family for the next quarter of a century. She maintained her patronages of countless organizations, from the Danish Red Cross to foundations for soldiers' welfare and cultural heritage societies. She continued to represent Denmark on official visits abroad, particularly when the Queen's schedule was full. She became a beloved elder stateswoman, a figure of immense dignity and national pride, her presence at any event lending it an extra layer of gravitas. But it was within her own family that she found her most profound and fulfilling new role. With the death of her husband, Ingrid fully stepped into the position of matriarch, not just of the Danish royal family, but of a sprawling, interconnected clan of European royalty. Her 3 daughters were now queens or princesses in 3 different countries. Her nephew, Karl XVI Gustaf, had become King of Sweden in 1973. Through the marriages of her children and other relatives, she was connected by blood or alliance to the royal houses of Norway, Great Britain, Greece, Spain, and Germany. She had, in a quieter, more modern way, recreated the role of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, as a central unifying figure for the continent's royalty. Her home, whether it was her apartments at Fredensborg or her beloved summer palace of Gustaf, became the heart of this extended family. Every summer a remarkable gathering would take place. Her daughters and their families would descend upon Gustaf for a long holiday. The formal gardens she had so lovingly cultivated became the playground for a new generation of princes and princesses from Denmark, Greece, and Germany. Photographs from these annual gatherings are a moving testament to the world she had built. They show a smiling, relaxed Ingrid, surrounded by her children and a swarm of grandchildren. the very picture of a contented grandmother. This was the ultimate triumph of her life. The little girl, who had her own happy family life brutally snatched away from her, had succeeded in creating a new one, larger and more resilient than she could have ever imagined. She had found in her grandchildren a joy and an uncomplicated love that must have healed the deepest wounds of her past. She was their beloved mama, a source of stories, of wisdom, and of a comforting, unshakable stability. She also remained a formidable intellect and a guardian of her family's history. Her passion for art, silver, and furniture never waned, and she became a recognized expert, often consulted by museums and historians. She meticulously organized the royal archives and collections, ensuring that the legacy of her husband's reign and the history of her family were preserved for future generations. Her gardens at Gustaf became her final masterpiece, a world-renowned example of landscape design that she continued to work on and perfect well into her old age. As the years passed, she settled into a comfortable and respected rhythm. She was a fixture of Danish life, a living link to a past that was rapidly fading from memory. She had seen her country through the Great Depression, a world war, post-war reconstruction, and the social revolutions of the 1960s. She had seen the monarchy evolve from a formal, distant institution into a beloved and integrated part of a modern democracy, and she had been a primary architect of that successful evolution. By the late 1990s, her great age began to catch up with her. Her public appearances became less frequent as her health declined. The nation watched with affection and concern as their formidable Queen Mother grew frail. In the autumn of 2000, she fell seriously ill and retreated to the peace and privacy of Fredensborg Palace, surrounded by her family. On November 7, 2000, with her 3 daughters and her 10 grandchildren by her side, Queen Ingrid died peacefully. She was 90 years old. The news of her death was met with a profound sense of national loss. Denmark mourned not just a former queen, but a figure who had been a constant, steadying presence for 65 years. Her death marked the end of an era. Her funeral was a major state occasion, attended by kings, queens, presidents, and dignitaries from around the world. It was a final, powerful testament to the immense respect and affection she had commanded. In a simple, poignant fulfillment of her deepest wish, she was laid to rest beside her beloved husband, Frederik, in a mausoleum outside Roskilde Cathedral, the traditional burial place of Danish monarchs. The Swedish princess had come home to rest forever in Danish soil. So what is the final enduring legacy of Queen Ingrid? It is a story of profound and inspiring contradictions. She was a woman born to immense privilege who learned the meaning of hardship. She was a figure of quiet, reserved dignity who became a powerful symbol of public defiance. She was a staunch traditionalist who played a central role in modernizing one of Europe's oldest monarchies. Her life offers a powerful lesson in the alchemy of character. She took the profound trauma of her childhood, the loss of her mother, the emotional void in her home, and transformed it into an unshakable sense of duty and a deep capacity for creating the very family stability she had been denied. She endured the terror of war and occupation, and through her quiet courage helped to redefine the relationship between a monarchy and its people for the modern age. She was the indispensable partner to a beloved king, the wise counsel to a successful queen, and the adored matriarch to a new generation of royalty. She proved that leadership does not always require a loud voice. Sometimes its greatest strength lies in a steady presence, a quiet example, and an unwavering commitment to the service of others. The story of Ingrid of Sweden is, in the end, the story of a survivor. She survived grief, she survived war, and she survived the immense crushing pressures of a life lived entirely in the public eye. She did not just endure, she prevailed, building a legacy of strength, dignity, and love that continues to shape the Danish monarchy to this day. She was the English rose who became the heart of Denmark, a queen whose greatest triumph was not the crown she wore, but the unshakable respect and affection she earned. Her life was, in every sense, a testament to the fact that the most enduring kingdoms are those that are built not on power, but in the hearts of the people.